This conversation is brought to you by our presenting sponsor, ExxonMobil. After our main stage conversation, we will have a fireside with Dr. Vijay Swarup, who is the Senior Director of Climate Strategy and Technology at ExxonMobil. We're going to hear more about what he does there and all of what ExxonMobil is doing in the energy space. As always, we encourage you to share on social media. You can find us at Punchbowl News on all social media platforms. With that, let's welcome the Congresswoman to the stage. Hi, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much.
All right, we are going to start this conversation with some news of the day, as we always do. I'm going to turn it over to you, Jake.
So welcome to the Punchbowl News stage. We are now day 3 of the convention. Chuck Schumer yesterday said there's been a sea change in voter energy since June. Do you sense that as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's so much enthusiasm. We're out. We've been home during the congressional August work period, and I'm just seeing it. We're seeing tons of volunteer signups. People are already out in Houston in August knocking on doors. They're excited to elect Colin Allred as the new senator from Texas, and they're really excited about the top of the ticket.
So we were talking about this offstage. I feel like I'm a adopted Houstonian because I'm married to a Houstonian, and your constituents, my in-laws are your constituents. I've been hearing since I started dating my wife many moons ago that Texas is going blue. I've kind of drowned that out in recent years, but is Texas going blue ever, and when?
Absolutely. Well, I think
the case. I want to hear the case for this.
I think we're going to see a statewide win in 2024. So we're going to get started this year.
Okay.
With more work ahead, obviously, in the years ahead. But I feel great about Colin Allred as our Senate candidate. And of course, y'all are DC folks. You know, he's somebody who people in Congress both like and respect. And I feel like as Texans, we deserve that in our senator. And I think people are really excited about him. And I think that he's put together an incredibly strong campaign. He's got the right message. He's got a great team. He knows how to win, as he and I both did in 2018, flipping districts from red to blue. And I think Texans are really ready for somebody who's, as he says, his team is Texas. We are ready for that. And so I think we're going to see an incredibly close campaign. But I think that in the end, we have a great chance of picking up our first statewide elected seat in 30 years in
30
Texas.
Years. Goodness.
And let me just say this, because I don't want to go on too long, but what you're seeing too is the infrastructure being built. We're continuing to work and build on those successes from 2018 and the re-elects in 2020. We have our first statewide coordinated campaign ever this year. And we are working. So we're building that infrastructure and making sure that we will turn Texas blue. It's not just going to happen, but it's going to happen because people do the work to make it happen. And it's going to happen because Democrats are the ones who are fighting for our freedom and fighting for our values. And that message is going to be all across Texas this year. And I think you're going to see some good things.
All right, well, we were at the RNC, and there was a lot of momentum there. A few weeks ago now at the DNC, we've seen a surge in polls for Kamala Harris and Democrats. I think a renewed vigor. A lot more folks decided to come to Chicago than maybe had on in their plans a couple of weeks ago. What did Democrats need to do between now and Election Day to win the House, and what should they avoid?
Well, I think that we've got a pretty good sense of what we need to do to win. We need to continue to support the incredible candidates that we have running, our frontliners who are in the toughest districts and our red to blue candidates. We only need to pick up 4 seats to win back the House. And I was in the class of 2018, so I have seen it. When you have great candidates, which we do for Democratic House members this year, you just need to let those candidates do their thing, talk to their communities, talk to their districts, and I think that that's really important. So continuing to support them, I'm working on that as the Battleground Finance Vice Chair for the DCCC, so making sure they've got the resources and the tools that they need. And I think, the key for us is making sure that we're talking to everybody. I think this is critical in Texas, and I think this is what I learned in 2018 is you've got to talk to everybody, because as we heard, especially from President Obama last night, right, in his remarks, remarks about how there's so much that connects us. There's so much that people want to see from our politicians and from our candidates. And what we want to see is people who are talking about the real things that matter to us. And that's what Democrats have been doing. I think we've got the money, the message, and the mobilization, as you know, the 3 M's. And we just have to keep recruiting and turning out our volunteers, making sure that people know the stakes in the election. And in states like mine, that people know how much their vote matters. It's going to matter in the Senate race. And I think if we can win the Senate race, maybe we can deliver our electoral votes for Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. It's not inconceivable.
Seems inconceivable.
Optimism is sky high here this morning, folks.
We're feeling good in Chicago.
That is quite the prediction. And you did flip a seat. I mean, when you came to Congress, you had a very difficult seat. So, okay, talk about policy. We're going to shift off of News of the Day and talk about some policy issues. You are co-chair of the Natural Gas Caucus. This is Texas is obviously a critical state for energy. Could you talk about some of your efforts when it comes to replacing coal-fired power plants for natural gas plants?
Well, sure. I think we've seen that transition has been happening over time. That is certainly, a market-driven decision, and also because of the shale revolution and because of what we've seen sort of happening outside. But I think it's also really important to focus on why that is such an important transition and how it helps us achieve our goals of reducing emissions across the board. And that's really a critical piece of that. Also, of course, we're very focused on the issues around LNG right now and making sure that we are exporting our liquefied natural gas to our allies around the world and making sure that we are helping address emissions, and we are helping make sure that we have our energy security and that our allies in Europe and elsewhere have access to that as well.
Good segue.
Truly. There has been frustration by many, including yourself, about the Biden administration's decision to pause new LNG export permits. You've written a letter to the administration on that. Talk about what you want to happen and what response you've seen from this administration.
Well, certainly I would like the administration to conclude its review. Certainly there has been a whole separate set of issues in the courts, but as to whether this can proceed. But I think, it's okay to say, let's take a pause and look at our criteria and make sure that we're asking the right questions. But at the end of the day, I think what we'll see is that they will reach their determination, as Democratic and Republican administrations have before, that it is in our national interest, that it's in our economic interest and our national security interest to export LNG. And I just hope they'll reach that decision soon, because I think the real concern is the uncertainty it creates, both in the markets, for our allies and others, and affects these sort of long-term projects, long-term contracts. That said, I think it's an opportunity to sort of make sure we're getting it right. And I think that we can, but I know the response I have gotten from the administration, we had Secretary Granholm before the Energy and Commerce Committee just a couple months ago, and I asked her when we could expect an answer, and she said by the end of the year or the very beginning of next year. So I think that the decision is imminent, and I think, I'm very optimistic that they'll reach the conclusion that others have before, that this is smart for us to do, and that it really is in our national security interest.
Now, being a Democrat who supports the energy industry is not unusual in Texas, but it might be a bit unusual in other parts of the country. I mean, talk about the politics about that and how you've seen your party shift on energy policy.
Well, I think there are a couple of things there. I mean, number one, I think my colleagues in the House Democratic Caucus know and appreciate that I'm a Texas Democrat. And, the guidance I've always gotten, the word I've always heard from everyone is, vote your district and represent your district. And so it's really important for me, as someone who represents so many people who work in the energy industry, to be a part of the conversation, to get on the Energy and Commerce Committee, to get on the Energy Subcommittee, to bring our perspective from Houston, the energy capital of the world, to these conversations we're having. And I think there are a couple of really important lessons that I feel like my colleagues are receptive to. I will tell you, I think there's been, for a long time, people haven't had to think about energy policy in the same way. They don't necessarily have long-held views, but they have information, they're aware of problems and concerns, and they want to solve them. And I think that is something we all want to do. The challenge for us is we need to build a very broad coalition to tackle climate change, to deal with emissions, to deal with the challenges that we know that we have, and do it in a way where we can create policy that's durable, right? We don't want, after we passed the IRA in the last Congress, when we got back this year, folks are trying to repeal it, and we had hearings on this with the Republicans in charge of the House. That's not good for the policy, it's not good for industry either, right? And now you're starting to see Republicans writing letters, at least as I understand, saying, please don't repeal some of these things in the tax bill next year because these are actually really good things, right? So people want to know, and this is what I hear from folks in my district all the time. They want to know the rules of the road so they can comply with them, and they don't want them to change dramatically so that they can make their plans for these massive investments, long-term projects. Of course, they want to deal with permitting. I'm sure that's on your list. But those are the kinds of things we need to do. So let's build a coalition where we can come together around smart policy that addresses the climate challenges that we face, that brings people in and makes everybody part of the solution, and that creates something that we can all work to achieve together. And I think that that's absolutely essential. That's how we do things in Houston. I'll just throw that out. That was kind of my pitch in 2018 when I was a candidate. My slogan that I made up myself, and so I was very proud of, was, we need a little more Houston in Washington, D.C. And it's because what we do is we come together. Houston's the most diverse city in the country. That surprises people too. Houston's most diverse city. People have vast life experience and opinions and views, and people come from all around the world, and they come together and they work together. That's what people want to see in Washington too. And on energy policy, it's absolutely essential.
Let's dig a little bit deeper into the specifics. Hydrogen, carbon capture. You have supported the High Velocity Hub in Houston. For those who are not Houstonians, tell us a little bit about what it does and why you're supporting it.
Terrific. Well, yes, one thing that might surprise people, and I do like to talk about how Houston's energy capital of the world, and it's because we have every facet of the energy space. Everything happens in Houston. And people may be surprised, but a third of the nation's existing hydrogen is already passing through Houston because of the refineries, because of the infrastructure that we have there. So it was a natural fit to have one of the hydrogen hubs that are created in the Inflation Reduction Act and these programs in the IIJA that we've created these hydrogen hubs. There's 7 of them across the country to really help develop this. The challenge we have right now, and all of the hubs got together in a letter earlier this year to say we need better guidance from Treasury, so we're still waiting on that. But the idea is to really catalyze a whole hydrogen industry and to be able to create that as a new and alternative. I mean, it's an existing fuel source, but to develop that further. And so there are great incentives to be able to do that. But of course, we need some guidance from the Treasury on how that's going to work. And right now, we're continuing to work to make it workable. I don't know that that's a real expression, but that's the challenge right now, is making sure that we can use existing facilities and existing technologies as part of that process and still get the credit under 45V.
Get the tax credit, right? That's what you're looking for clarity on?
Yeah, on the guidance from Treasury around 45V.
The permitting reform discussion is a big discussion. Anytime we talk about energy, and Congress has been very close and had fits and starts, as Anna said earlier, on permitting reform. I want to dig into that in a second. You've been an advocate for increasing the speed of permitting when it comes to carbon capture and storage, pushing Energy Secretary Jennifer Granholm and others on the issue. What role do you think carbon capture has in decarbonizing the economy, U.S. economy?
Well, it plays a huge role, right? We're talking about getting to carbon neutral. How do we do that? Well, one of the things we can do is capture and store or reuse carbon. And so what we need to be able to do, and in Texas, we have this incredible geology where we can store it in the earth, but we got to get it there. So we have to be able to build those CO2 pipelines. We have to deal with the permitting around that, permitting reform more broadly, but hydrogen and CO2 pipelines need new permitting guidance. And need sort of some clarity around that. We're waiting really on the permit applications for CO2 specifically, so we need EPA to work on the Class 6 well permitting and other things so that we can keep it moving. But it plays a huge role in getting us to our goals, and I think that that's what we have to look at is what are all the different pieces that we need to put in place to reach our climate goals and our objectives, and carbon capture is a huge piece of that. We know that technology exists. We know that folks in the industry have been using it for a long time for enhanced oil recovery, so we know it can be done, and we know there are great opportunities for that technology to help do other things as well, like direct air capture is really exciting to a lot of folks, but we need to be able to do it, and it starts with permitting the pipelines to be able to move it, to be able to use it and store it.
Could permitting reform happen this year, do you think, in an end-of-year package? I mean, what is your when will it happen, and what are the dynamics that need to be in place to make it happen?
Well, certainly I think it could happen, and I think you're right. It's not going to happen before November, as far as I can tell.
I don't think so.
I think there are a couple of must-pass end-of-year packages, and of course we just saw the bill pass the Senate out of the committee, 15-4, so good bipartisan bill. I know that there are some, House folks want to do some work on it, and the White House has expressed a few concerns, but we see something that's moving that I think is a really good start. And certainly we've been working on it in the House in our capacity, and really trying to bring, for me, the experience of the people I represent who have a lot to say here on this topic. So I am hopeful that it is something that we can move, because it really is key across the board for people being able to accomplish the things that we want to accomplish, to make some of these great programs and the things that we're trying to make possible out of the historic legislation we passed in the 117th Congress. To make those things work, we've got to be able to issue the permits to build the infrastructure that we need. So whether we're talking about transmission lines, or whether we're just talking about speeding up the process and making sure that the CO2 pipelines can get permitted, we've got to figure all of those things out. And I think we've got a really good start. I think we've got a really good framework. I think all the issues have been identified, so it's a matter of working it out to the end. But I am hopeful that we can move it in a year-end package.
I want to zoom out a little bit. You talked a little bit about energy security and how important that was given what's happening in the geopolitical landscape right now. You have the American Gas for Allies Act. You have some other legislation that you're focused on. Talk about that a little bit.
So there are a couple of things, and I think that and the RISE Act, which is my other sort of big priority that I'm also hoping we can work into, and I think we've gotten a commitment to at least consider it.
It's a start.
It's a start and a commitment to think about whether we could work it in with permitting reform. So I think one of the big issues with American Gas for Allies Act is obviously seeing what happened in Ukraine following Russia's invasion, and seeing the need for our allies in Europe who do not automatically get expedited review, right? If you're a country with a free trade agreement with the United States, you get expedited review of these LNG permits. That is not true for our allies in Europe. So it seems to make a lot of sense to have the same provisions for our NATO allies. And so I introduced that bill. We're still trying to move it. We still feel really good about that. Of course, it ties into the bigger LNG questions, but I think it's smart policy, and it's obviously good for our national security. So I'm optimistic about that. And then the other piece is the RISE Act, and that's really important to help address coastal communities and communities like ours that are feeling the effects of climate change, that are subject to these extreme weather events, as we have just had two in Houston this year. We had our of course, we just had Hurricane Beryl, and we had a derecho earlier this year. So a lot of crazy weather in Houston.
Always something in Houston.
A lot of damage, but we will survive it, and we will keep going. But we have some great ideas for projects to help protect, certainly the ship channel. It's been 16 years we've been talking about building the Ike Dike, for those in Houston who will appreciate hearing that, and making sure that we're protecting these facilities and communities all along the ship channel and the broader region, and from potential catastrophe. So this bill is one that will help bring funds to states, get a share of offshore wind leasing revenue. Right now it just goes to the Treasury, so sharing that back with the states, lifting the cap for states like mine, lifting the revenue cap on GOMESA funds, and other things to really help us invest in our shorelines, economies. So it's a really great bill. It's bipartisan. It's bicameral. We introduced it in the last Congress, and we've introduced it again. And I'm very hopeful and optimistic that we'll see that move, because it's just smart policy. There's so much that's good in there, and we've got a great coalition working to make that happen.
We are quickly running out of time. We're going to get the hook. One of the things we focus on is legislating, and energy is a space where you are always going to have those bipartisan coalitions. It won't work otherwise, either in a Republican majority or in a Democratic majority. How do you build those coalitions at a time where coalitions on almost any issue are increasingly difficult to come by?
Well, look, that's a great question, and I think that that's a challenge in our politics and in the House right now, where we have to get back that. I had a really interesting conversation a few months ago now, I was seated next to one of my Republican colleagues flying up to Washington, and he said, there are a bunch of my constituents that think I shouldn't even be talking to you right now. And it's like, we can't do that. Like, the stakes are too high. We have to know how to work together, and we have to value working together. And so I think that also comes from us explaining to our constituents what we do, why we do it, and how we work together. That doesn't mean that we don't have to stand our ground and fight for our values, because certainly there are a lot of issues that are not on today's agenda, but where we do have to fight for what we want. But in the energy space, I think one of the greatest risks we have is the politicization of energy policy and making this a wedge issue. I've seen it in my own races in Texas, and I think that's a huge risk. The uncertainty it would create, the idea, like I said earlier, of passing massive legislation only to undo it 2 years later, that is not what people want to see happen. And so you have to build these coalitions. And I think it comes just person to person, finding the connections you have with people. And there are folks on the other side of the aisle that I think are really working to try to find those areas of opportunity to collaborate. And in this space, it's an absolute must. We have to do it.
All right. Representative Fletcher, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Anna and Jake. Great to be with you.
You guys can head off. All right, now I would like to welcome Dr. Vijay Swarup, Senior Director of Climate Strategy and Technology at ExxonMobil, for a fireside chat. Please. All right. Dr. Swarup, thank you so much for joining me this morning.
Thank you.
Welcome to Chicago.
Yeah, it's awesome.
All right, let's get started. First things first, I want you to frame up your role at Exxon. Can you share a bit about what you are focused on as Senior Director for Climate Strategy and Technology at ExxonMobil?
Yeah, well, first, thank you all for staying. I know it's beautiful outside, and there's probably a lot going on, so really appreciate it. And I want to manage expectations here, okay? I'm a scientist, not a political scientist, okay? So I'm going to stay in my zone. It is an honor to be here, and I've had a long career with Exxon. I've been with them over 35 years, which is another rule. Once it's over 35, you don't count anymore, okay? So 35 plus, various roles, but the two most relevant to this discussion is I led our R&D group for about 10 years, and you heard Secretary Brier earlier talk about the work we did with the Department of Energy in advancing research. And then most recently, for the last couple of years, I've been in our central planning group advising the corporation on climate strategy and the interface between policy and technology, which is really where I focus on. How do we get, and you heard Representative Fletcher earlier talk about this, policy and technology have to go hand in hand if we're going to get to where we want to go as a society.
So we heard Representative Fletcher talk about kind of the whole mix that's needed, right? And earlier this morning we had a CEO roundtable with people representing all the different sectors. ExxonMobil often talks about the role of the oil and gas industry in the energy transition with the phrase, the and equation. What is the and equation?
Well, yeah, let's talk about the word and. I'm a big fan of conjunctions. You guys remember conjunction, junction? I love and. And is inclusive. And as everybody gets to be part of it, or is exclusive. So let's start there. Energy, the scale of this industry is actually unimaginable. And everything in this room has a direct correlation to energy. So when we talk about and, we talk about it in multiple ways. The first and is we have to continue to supply energy. It has to be continuous. You don't want to wait for the energy to arrive. It has to be continuous, and we have to reduce emissions. We need new technology, and we need policy to support that technology. We need governments working with private industry. We need universities working with labs. So it's a series of ands, but the highest and of all is you got to meet demand, and you have to lower emissions. If we get that problem statement, I mean, who's going to disagree with that problem statement? That's the problem statement. And the first thing you learn in engineering school is get the problem right. If we get the problem right, you have a much higher probability of getting the answer right. So that's the and, and we've got to focus on the and.
Well, I want to talk about that because over the past several years, we've seen companies, we've seen pledges by countries about where they're gonna go, how they're gonna get to neutral sooner than maybe they had expected. Those aren't being met, right? Going forward, what do you think needs to change to get to that problem statement into the answer? What's the solution?
I think it's real simple. We have to go from pledges to plans to action. So you've mentioned pledges. Pledges are great. The pledges have to be converted to action. You're beginning to see signs of that, and you're beginning to see some of the AND equation work. You just heard about the IRA. That is a technology agnostic policy, which allows for technology to come out. And you're beginning to see plans, and companies like ours are actually now going from plans to action. As we announce carbon capture projects, we announce a hydrogen project. So it's beginning. The scale of this industry is so large that it's going to begin small. But again, we know a couple of things about energy. Scale goes up, costs come down. So you've got to get on to getting it on the deployment curve. And as you deploy more, it will happen. But we've got to get the right policies and the right collaborations in place to do it.
Let's talk about that, the focus on the energy transition. Some are frustrated that it isn't happening as fast as they would like it to be. What do you think it will take to accelerate the energy transition?
So, a word, and this is as close to a rhyme as I can get. If you want to accelerate, you have to collaborate. Okay? So this comes back to the and again. And so I think from the technology side, look, one of the greatest things we have in this country are our national labs. We're about a half of 1 hour away from Argonne National Lab, which is where the model that underpins the IRA, the GREET model, exists. So the collaboration at the science level is needed. Universities, national labs, companies, the collaboration at the policy level, the collaboration within companies, bringing capabilities together, are all needed. So I think if we want to get on with, and I like the word accelerate, because you hear the word speed a lot. It's really not speed. It's about acceleration. And so if we can get to that acceleration, I think we can get where we want to go.
And do you feel like there is that collaboration that's starting when you talk about kind of the private sector, the public sector, government? We often say that adds a lot of zeros when we think about some of these big societal problems. Are you starting to see that kind of collaborative spirit?
Well, we are, and one of the things that allows that collaborative spirit is events like this. Because if we don't talk about this, and if we don't talk about this in a solutions-oriented format, it's going to get really hard to get to the solution. So, yeah, like in research, you have to be an optimist, because our primary product in research is failure. You're looking for that byproduct called success. So here, we've got to stay optimistic, and we've got to just keep talking about this, because I think we're all trying to get to the same place. I think we actually agree far more than we disagree, but I like to focus on the agreement, and then take where we have the agreements and go forward. And so again, the IRA is a good example of that. The technologies that are being deployed, you heard earlier today about the small modular reactors. And again, companies like ours, we're focusing where we have strengths. This is a capabilities industry, so we're good at taking things and converting them to things. And that's why we're working on hydrogen and biofuels and CCS and things like that, because it plays to our strengths. Others should play to their strengths, and collectively we'll get where we want to go.
So you've heard a lot this morning about permitting reform, how everybody kind of wants it. I'm not going to ask you to go too deep in the weeds. I know you're not a day-to-day policy person, but talk maybe more generally from that 100,000-foot perspective about why is permitting reform needed when we think about the energy transition?
Well, let's think about the three legs that have to work together here. You need technology, you need policy, and you need infrastructure. Now, let's talk about how you actually move that along. Technology has to have line of sight to scale. If you can't scale this, right, the number of zeros in energy is ridiculously high. So technology has to have line of sight to scale. Policy has to have line of sight to markets. This can't be policy-driven forever. Ultimately, markets have to be formed around the technologies, and quite frankly, infrastructure is how you bridge. And what you heard earlier today, and I totally believe this because we understand the technology behind this, where you can repurpose assets, that's your head start. So the U.S., with the 1 million miles of natural gas pipelines and the existing infrastructure in places like Houston, you got to reuse that and let the technology guys figure out how to reuse the assets. But permitting reform includes allowing repurposing of assets, allowing blending of products together where you have the the chemistry capabilities to understand that you're actually making and doing what you need to do. We know, we've learned a lot over the last 30 years. We need to apply those 30 years of knowledge to the next 30.
Talk about technology innovation, right? It's been kind of exciting to hear everybody talk about where the industry is going, right? And kind of thinking about what is the next 5 to 10 years and what does that look like? Can you talk about how important it is when it comes to decarbonization at scale?
Yeah, well, first off, I think this industry doesn't get near the credit it deserves to get for innovation. I mean, this industry, think about this industry. It is every discipline of science, every discipline of engineering, every discipline of social science, political science. All of it has to come together. And think about the innovations of what we do today. Think about the scale of energy today. And then remind yourself that the vast majority of the technologies came from the U.S., came from the Department of Energy, came from the universities in the U.S., and came from companies like ours in the U.S. And now we have this great challenge of saying, okay, do it again. Do it with lower emissions, but don't for 1 minute think that you're going to cut back on how much energy you're providing. That's an incredible challenge to scientists. And you're beginning to see that playing out. Look at the Department of Energy and the number of grants that they're giving out. Look at what Stanford's and the MITs are doing. Look at what Argonne National Lab and NREL and all the other national labs are doing. Quite frankly, look at what we're doing. Look at the research and the places that we're focusing on, challenging paradigms with greater capabilities. You know, when I started, a calculator around your belt was really the thing. I mean, I could holster that calculator. I thought it was the most awesome thing ever, okay? Because you know what? Slide rules? No, we're not doing slide rules. We're doing calculators on my belt. Now my phone, I worked on a supercomputer when I first started. My phone has more power than that supercomputer, and I can play music and take pictures. So, look, we have a whole different skill set. We got to motivate the students. So we spend a lot of time with universities because, look, if you want to really make an impact, get into energy. Get into energy because this is a great challenge, and it's going to be enabled by all these capabilities that we have.
We are quickly running out of time, but I want to ask you one last question that I often ask in these fireside chats. What is the one thing you want our audience to take away from our conversation?
I think it's that this is a technology challenge. It's a challenge at scale. And I think we need to get on with getting the right enabling policies, the right enabling infrastructure to be able to deploy the technology. But the last thing I want to do, the most important thing from my perspective, is companies like ours are on it. Okay, we get it, we're on it, we're doing things. And the more we can advance the discussion, the more likely and faster we'll get to the solution. And then the final thing, of course, is thank you for sticking around for this fireside. Thank you.
Dr. Swarup, thank you so much for your time this morning. We really appreciate it. A big thank you to Representative Fletcher and her team for joining us this morning, and to ExxonMobil for being our presenting sponsor. Next up, we have a networking lunch. So there's going to be food over there. And afterwards, Jake Sherman is going to be on stage talking to Phil Morris, a partner at LSG, about the Canvas and what we are learning with our Insiders poll. Thanks so much. Stick around.